Hi everyone, my name is Ethan Mowell, and I am doing this presentation today as part of History 422 here at Eastern Oregon University. This is Violence in American History with Professor Derringer. We are going to be talking today about race and its effect on the level of violence that was seen and experienced in World War II in the Pacific Theater. This was a very interesting and very fun topic to do research on. I am very glad that I got to go ahead to do this project. It was very informative. I think I learned a lot, and so I hope you guys enjoyed this as well. I do want to clarify that the topics being discussed in this are very graphic in nature, both in terms of the violence that is depicted and in the way that the Japanese specifically are depicted racially speaking. So there's a content warning here for the material that we'll be going over ahead. I want to make sure that I'm upfront about that in case anybody who is watching is sensitive to this kind of material. I think our aim in these projects is to depict this history of violence in American history respectfully yet honestly as well, and being upfront with ourselves about remembering our past. So with that aside, we can move forward. So when looking at the Second World War, the experience of those in the Pacific Theater is very different from those on any other front in the war. We definitely recognize the ways that race exacerbated the conflict in the Eastern Front, in the Eastern Theater, with the Germans and with the Eastern European peoples, the Soviets, Ukrainians. The Germans had a ideology built up around race that led to many of the massacres, many of the atrocities that were experienced there. And for American soldiers who went and fought on the Western Front in North Africa, Italy, and in Western Europe, this didn't exist to the same degree. We looked at the Germans, and while we despised the rhetoric and the ideology of Nazism, we still, racially speaking, could identify good Germans and distinguish them we can distinguish them from the Nazis and their acts, who were most commonly associated with the horrors of Germany and the Second World War in Europe. For the experience of the Americans and the Japanese in the Pacific, race did a lot to worsen the conditions there in terms of exacerbating violence and the brutality of the conflict. So when we take a look at how this sort of begins to develop, we can identify two major imperial powers, Japan and then essentially the United States and Britain as two of the main colonizers of Asia at the time. They were able to take the rhetoric of each other and the outward expressions that each was espousing about themselves, and essentially to weaponize it against the other. So the Japanese looked at the United States particularly and the individualism that they promoted and attributed to themselves, and they identified this as greedy, and they saw in the United States an imperial power that was bent on further subjugating the peoples of Asia under colonial authority. Same with the UK. For the Western powers, they saw the propaganda of the Japanese, things like coordinated gestures towards the emperor, the cheers of Japanese soldiers in combat footage, and they saw a distinct lack of individualism, and they attributed to the Japanese the idea that they were mindless, that they didn't think for themselves, and that they were wholly unified as a people to the emperor. It's interesting that the justifications that both use as war in the Pacific escalates both very anti-imperial, because the United States is trying to check the aggression of the now, though late to the party, the expanding Japanese empire, and the Japanese identify for themselves the role of helping other peoples of Southeast Asia and of China in liberating themselves from colonization. So I think it's very interesting the way that develops. So again, Japan's war in China, they have this doctrine of a co-prosperity sphere, where again they want to help the other peoples of Asia to kick out the Western powers and their influence, their subjugation, and to help create a unified pan-Asian movement, essentially. So they depict Westerners as colonizers, as wealthy plantation owners who are taking advantage of the peoples of Asia and of their resources. Early on in the war, we see, as it escalates in China, Japan begins things like bombing campaigns that are affecting civilian populations, and we see an escalation in operations that are aimed essentially against partisan groups of resistance fighters in China. But both of these do inevitably though is lead to massacres of populations of Chinese civilians. This catches the attention of the Western powers early on, particularly the bombing. Similarly, they were concerned with Germany's use of bombing in their early invasions of Poland as well. There's a lot of moral concerns about the targeting of civilians in war during this time. It's interesting, later on we'll kind of talk about how that situation evolves throughout the course of the war. So some of the most common atrocities that the Japanese committed are massacres of non-combatants. Maltreatment of prisoners is very common. Things like not feeding them. Forced marches, like the Bataan Death March is very, very famous for that. Torture along the way. And then forced labor is something that is very commonly committed and then depicted in Western propaganda against the Japanese as well. Here is an example of some of the bombing that China was subjugated to by the Japanese in their invasion and occupation of China. This is a very famous image of similar bombings. Obviously, the Americans enter the war directly after Pearl Harbor on both the Western Front, at this point really in North Africa against the Germans, and then they begin war in the Pacific theater in a series of both naval and aerial engagements before some of the first fighting on different islands throughout the South Pacific. They were very disturbed again early on by Japan's use of bombings against civilians. They identified in the Japanese a homogenous and unified movement. They looked towards some of the staples, some of the pillars of Japan's culture, things like Shintoism and the ideals of Hakuichu. They perceived of the Japanese as a people wholly dedicated to the emperor, tying him in with both their national identity and their religion, and in that identifying for themselves the ambitions of expanding Japan's empire. First throughout Asia, they establish this idea of a pan-Asian kind of co-prosperity movement, and yet they simultaneously contend with the feelings of Japanese superiority and of them being essentially on the top of the hierarchy as far as Asia's nationalities and ethnicities are concerned. So we also see in the wake of Pearl Harbor some of the first major attempts of the United States to create this propaganda against the Japanese and to distinguish them for the first time from other groups of Asians. And so we see here as an example the term yellow is one that we'll talk about here. Prior to all of this, Generally speaking, racism was a lot more vague towards Asians. We don't see things like specific nationalities targeted really until this time, and in that we see that the Americans have to expend some effort here, rhetorically distancing the Japanese from the Chinese, who are now their allies in this fight. And so the term that stood out to me was whitening. That Americans had to whiten the Chinese as a way of separating them from, say, the yellow Japanese. And again, I apologize for um, the, the the racial aspect of this presentation for that. It definitely is something that it's very uncomfortable to discuss. Um, we see terms like Oriental, which is again a very good example of the vagueness of how they would describe people from the Far East. Um, we see that replaced, and so now we see epithets that are designed specifically to describe and to embody the Japanese versus Asians as a whole. Um, Hollywood, in its depictions of the Japanese, has three main forms of racism that they develop in their films that are acting as propaganda for the war. The verbal ones, so again, these specific epithets. Physically, they use things like makeup to accentuate different racial differences between the Japanese and, say, the Chinese are obviously against white Americans. One of the ways, actually, that I think is kind of interesting, we talk a lot today about whitewashing in cinema, and one way that they could distinguish Chinese protagonists in these films from Japanese antagonists would be to use white actors to make sure that the American audience can make that distinguishment. Psychologically, again, we see films that begin to reinforce these ideas that they are individually mentally weak, that they don't think for themselves. There seems to be a lot of rhetoric that insinuates that they're very much hive-minded and inherently militaristic as well, both culturally and naturally as a race, and then completely, without question, loyal to the emperor as well. Moving beyond that a little bit, this is something that I thought was kind of interesting when I found this cartoon. Very unfortunate. I identified two specific times where they, in their text here, bring up phrases like the gigantic task of extermination, or that Tokyo area must be completely annihilated. And I was very much reminded of earlier in the term when my classmates and I talked about the broad platform of extermination that was described by Americans in their actions against the Native American peoples. That they even at the time used characteristics to portray the Native Americans as animals, and very much identified their goal as ethnic cleansing of the Native American populations. And so here within the March 1945 edition of Leatherneck magazine, we see this cartoon that is essentially the culmination of the course of the war and the propaganda and the way it evolved to center around themes of exterminating the Japanese people. By now we see that in a lot of my American minds, the only way to end the war would be to completely exterminate the Japanese as a people in order to actually end the fighting, because by now people had identified that Japan would not surrender and they would fight till the end for their emperor. And so they used that understanding to justify these phrases like extermination and annihilation. I think it was interesting that this pops up, and this is the same month, apparently, that low-level incendiary bombing became, I believe, the predominant bombing operation that the U.S. Air Force basically was engaging in at this time. So we start to see mass firebombing operations of primarily civilian populated areas and targets. So early on in the war, Americans and people in the West generally were very surprised by the efficiency and the effectiveness of the Japan forces in both achieving surprise and in winning major victories early on against Western armies. We see throughout the course of the war rhetoric that evolves from the Japanese as being inferior to the Western forces to to degrading them to the status of animal while simultaneously recognizing the effectiveness of their fighters. We see on the right side here a cartoon that suggests that the animalistic nature of the Japanese, here depicted as apes, unfortunately, that is what explains their effectiveness in fighting these campaigns in the jungles. And then on the left, in a cartoon that is discussing the accounts of a veteran from the British forces there, in that brutality is a part of their fighting equipment. Regarding prisoners of war in the Pacific Theater, one thing that is, I think, pretty commonly understood, although still very striking to kind of observe and to become aware of, the extent to which Americans did not take or could not take prisoners of war from the Japanese forces versus those of the Germans, where in Europe it was not uncommon to see enemy forces surrender en masse to you on either side. And that did not really happen in the Pacific Theater between the Americans and the Japanese. It's kind of interesting the way this cycle develops. Early on in the war, there are a lot of Americans who note that there are instances where Japanese will falsely surrender and use that as a guise with which to attack. There are a lot of instances of, say, booby trapping of the dead and things like that. That definitely sows a lot of distrust and anger in Americans who are very confused by this enemy that they're fighting and the ways in which they're fighting. And so they become less willing, and by the end of the war, there are certain leaders, military leaders, who are refusing at all to take prisoners. Similarly, Japanese military doctrine makes it harder for those forces to surrender as well. And when we get to fighting in places like, say, Okinawa, where civilians on the Japanese side are present, they themselves also struggle with making it safely behind American lines. And so it seems like a spiraling cycle where it becomes harder and harder for forces to surrender as the war increases in its brutality, to the point where by the last battle of the war in Okinawa was, I believe, where the Americans were able to capture the most Japanese, but compared to the amount of forces who were garrisoned on the island who actually died in the fighting, it was still a very low percent. So it very much was seen by both armies as a fight to the death on these islands, and it definitely escalated in the brutality of this conflict. Moving on to war trophies. This is something that's very unique. There are accounts, obviously, of massacres of Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe by the Germans early on in their invasions, and these acts were photographed, certainly, and those photos can be kind of conceived as trophies of sorts. But my understanding is that the taking of body parts and things like that was something that was very unique to the Americans against the Japanese in the Pacific during this war. We can attribute this to American forces essentially ranking the people that they were fighting in different degrees of humanness. So this is something that Americans, it would be inconceivable for Americans to do this to Germans or Italians or people that they can more easily identify with. But the rhetoric and the propaganda that they had been exposed to had taken away these levels of humanness to the Japanese, and thus sent a lot of them along a path to where they would eventually scavenge the battlefield for half-rotten corpses and take skulls and boil them or let ants eat at them until the skin was gone, and they would decorate them and keep skulls as pets or as truck ornaments, things like that. And again, this all goes back to the Japanese were viewed very commonly as animals, as treacherous, backstabbing, rats, insects, you name it. This is added on by, some scholars argue, America's culture with hunting. And we see, very comedic examples of Jap hunting licenses. And again, I apologize for the term. And so with, that understanding, we could perceive of Americans going to war and understanding this not as a war against a human enemy, but as hunting those who are less than human. And thus, that can kind of help explain why people might want to take trophies from this hunt as souvenirs, essentially, and as a touristy kind of way of saying, I was there, I was at this fight, I have the skull to prove it. This is a very famous picture of, I believe, this was on Life magazine's cover, of this lady who's writing a thank you letter to her boyfriend for sending her this desk ornament that is a skull. It's very weird. Again, here's this hunting license. Keep them dying. Yeah, it's very, again, racially charged for sure. So more examples here of skulls. Skulls being very commonly collected after the fact. There are recollections of people like Eugene Sledge, who, according to his memoirs and stuff, teeth were very, very common. You did not often see soldiers who would allow those around them to collect skulls, mainly because of how disgusting the process could be. Because again, these would either have to wait and decompose in the sun and be eaten by ants, or they would boil them in vats. And either way, it was a very disgusting process, and people didn't really want to be around it. But obviously, here, as we can see by accounts, these guys have collected a lot of skulls and seem very proud of their collections. Another account that seemed to happen very regularly was the taking of leg bones and shaping them into things like letter openers and blades, or accounts of wanting to preserve body parts, things like noses and ears, by pickling, and similarly making of necklaces. The Australians very much engaged in this war along racialized lines as well. They viewed the fight against the Japanese as essentially a war to protect white Australia from the encroachment of the imperialist Japanese. So they were reluctant to photograph their own dead, but there are a lot of photographs you can find of them posing the enemy Japanese killed, which you could interpret as essentially a trophy and collecting a photograph from it, but of celebrating your victory over your slain enemies by exerting your control over their corpses through posing them and things like that. So the U.S. was not alone in this. As we move on farther and farther into the war, something that becomes a lot more common is slaughter bombing, is what the Japanese referred to it as, because the Americans begin using firebombs increasingly more often, as Japan's infrastructure at this point in a lot of its urban areas is still primarily wooden in its architecture. This is a very effective means of starting firestorms in Japan's civilian populations. So Tokyo being one of the largest, obviously it was definitely a primary target. There are estimates that up to 400,000 Japanese were killed from these actions by U.S. Air Forces. Here we kind of go back to the interesting dichotomy where earlier in the war, Japan was criticized by Western powers, as was Germany, for their use of what seemed like indiscriminate bombing against civilian populations. But America comes to take on the primary role in engaging in this practice as the war goes on, and those criticisms don't necessarily translate into a whole lot of public outcries over the morality of the Americans engaging in this. That's definitely recognized, and so the quote here at the bottom of the page kind of is an example of that. There's a brigadier general who described the acts against the Japanese here as the most ruthless and barbaric killings of non-combatants in all history, though this is more in a confidential, I believe, memoir or things like that. So it was not, very common to hear people discuss this publicly. A lot of people, I think, understood the propaganda of the time that stated that this would need to happen and that the Japanese would need to be exterminated in order for the war to actually end. Talking about some of the effects of this happening, some of the legacies of race in the Pacific theater. It's very interesting to note that after the war's conclusion, the rhetoric that was weaponized and targeted against the Japanese softens very, very quickly. And so here's an example of I believe the September issue of Leatherneck magazine, where this Japanese enemy, while still retaining the ape-like qualities obviously in this depiction, is more annoyed now and maybe a nuisance, but not near as dangerous of a threat anymore. There are some things that are revealed in the scholarship in this field that the ideals that Americans essentially took, the racist ideologies that they took and applied to the Japanese, came from some very vague understandings of race prior to the war. And that meant that throughout the course of the war, this rhetoric was still vague enough that it could be easily shifted from the Japanese in defeat and essentially attached to enemies moving forward into the Cold War. An example being the Soviet Union, who Americans perceived as very much not individualistic, as hive-minded, completely loyal to Stalin and to the communist cause. And so that is a common theme that survives the Pacific theater and is attached to later enemies. And it's very interesting that some of the major enemies that we fought after this time were all in the Pacific, in whether it was North Korea, China, or say Vietnam. So some very specific racial epithets and ideas about race that were levied against the Japanese survive that war and are applied later on to America's enemies during the Cold War. Really good example of that is that when we talk about things like collecting ears, we very commonly think of the Vietnam conflict. And I found an example here of a U.S. GI with a skull, that he is, got as a camp decoration here in his patrol base. So this stuff definitely still occurred in the Second World War. It's just something that collectively Americans' memory of it is not as prevalent. It was something that was, despite its documentation, was pretty quickly forgotten. This definitely happened enough that U.S. military leadership were very concerned about it, and there was, surviving correspondence, among them that proves that. But these practices did continue on in fights against enemies that American soldiers could identify as racially different or racially inferior to them. And then there's some sources here. Know Your Enemy Japan is something that I definitely recommend people look at. It was free on YouTube. Thank you to the U.S. National Archives for that. This took a lot of Japan's own propaganda and essentially was able to weaponize it against them, and I think was very interesting. Though it was not released, I believe, in time. By the time it was released, it was 1945, and the war was already almost over. But and then as far as really important literature for this, John Dower's War Without Mercy is a very good book to read if you're interested in finding out more about this stuff. So before I ramble on too much longer, I want to thank you guys for coming and checking out my presentation. I hope you guys learned a lot. Again, I apologize for the subject matter that is inherently involved in this. Want to make sure to let you guys know I really enjoyed this term. I really think it was entertaining. It was very sobering to learn about the underbelly of American history, it seems, and the violence that we've committed collectively throughout our years. Make sure to take care of yourselves over spring break and into next term with coronavirus going around and everything. Be safe, and see you guys next term. Best of luck with finals. Thank you guys again.